Al Capone, the very definition of the gangster era, the king of Chicago, the face of organised crime. But before the beer wars and the massacres, before the notoriety and the fame, Capone was just another Brooklyn tough caught in a bloody battle for control of the docks and the fortune that flowed through them. Because in the early 20th century, the Brooklyn waterfront was amongst the most valuable real estate in New York. Not because of the land itself, but because of what moved through it. Every day, cargo from around the world poured in: sugar, tobacco, coal, whiskey, offloaded by the ton and funneled straight into New York City. Whoever controlled the docks didn't just control the trade, they controlled the money, the labour, the jobs, and the muscle that kept the waterfront alive. And for a time, that power belonged entirely to the Irish mob. The White Hand Gang, a fiercely territorial and hard-drinking Irish street outfit, held a stranglehold over the Brooklyn waterfront. From Vinegar Hill to Red Hook, from the Erie Basin to Piers 1 through 9, they ran the hiring halls, controlled the longshoremen's unions, and taxed every crate that came in or out of the East River. They answered to no one, and they didn't intend to start. Their boss, Dinny Meehan, ruled with quiet but absolute ruthlessness. If you wanted to move cargo through the docks, you went through Dinny. And if you crossed him, you didn't last long, because then you'd have to answer to his main enforcers, Wild Bill Lovett, a decorated World War I machine gunner turned alcoholic street legend, responsible for more dockside murders than the rest of the gang combined, and the infamous Peg Leg Lonergan, a one-legged street brawler and had shot dead 3 rivals by the age of 13. In the early 20th century, they were the most feared men in Brooklyn. Together, they firmly kept the waterfront under Irish control, but that control wouldn't go unchallenged forever. Because away from the piers, in the Italian neighbourhoods of Brooklyn to the south of the docks, another crew was gathering strength: the Italian Black Hand Gang, led by a slick, sadistic killer named Frankie Yale. He was just as ruthless as Dinny Meehan and also had loyal killers at his side. His second in command was the terrifying Willie Two-Knife Altieri, a man who regularly went mick hunting and who earned his nickname from his favourite pastime of carving up Irishmen. Next in line was a young street enforcer already showing signs of potential, and one who would become the most famous gangster of them all, Al Capone, the man who would go on to become the face of the underworld. But before he ruled Chicago with ruthless violence, he forged that ruthless violence in the brutal battle for the docks against the Irish. And the Black Hand were not content to stay in the shadows. They wanted the docks and the empire that came with it. The Irish were brutal, just as tough as the Italians, but disorganised. They drank hard, fought each other harder, and let grudges override structure. The Italians, on the other hand, were focused, sober, and surgical. They believed they could run the docks better and make it more fruitful. What followed was a bitter, bloody turf war, one that left bodies on the cobblestones and Irish influence sinking into the East River. It's a war unlike anything I've ever covered before. It literally has everything. Al Capone getting run out of New York after a bar fight with a White Hand brawler, Peg Leg Lonergan's sister shooting her father dead in a bike shop, Machine Gun Jack McGurn, the man who organised the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Well, his father was murdered in a case of mistaken identity, and Al Capone carrying out his first massacre on Christmas Day, effectively ending the war. And this is the story of that war. This is the bloody battle of Brooklyn docks, the Irish mob versus the Italian Mafia. In the mid to late 1800s, more than 4.5 million Irish men, women and children poured into the United States, the largest influx of immigrants in the nation's history at the time. Between 1845 and 1852, Ireland was devastated by what they called Ungurta Mór, the Great Hunger. The potato crop, the lifeblood of the Irish poor, failed repeatedly due to a lethal blight. But the famine itself was no accident. It was a product of British colonial neglect, economic cruelty, and political disdain. Whilst people starved in the west of Ireland, British landlords exported grain and beef to England. 1 million Irish people died of hunger and disease, and another million fled. Many escaped aboard on what came to be known as coffin ships, overcrowded, unsanitary vessels packed with starving immigrants. Those who survived the Atlantic crossing and landed in New York found little comfort waiting for them. Too poor to travel west, most Irish immigrants crowded into Manhattan's slums, crumbling tenements in the notorious Five Points district and Hell's Kitchen. These were neighbourhoods plagued by overcrowding, poverty and disease, places so bleak that many of their new Irish inhabitants might have preferred another voyage on the coffin ships. But in 1883, there was finally a glimmer of hope. The completion of the Brooklyn Bridge opened a new path across the East River, linking the overcrowded streets of Manhattan to the wide industrial sprawl of Brooklyn. For many Irish families, it was an escape, a chance at cheaper rent, more space, and better paying work in the shipyards, factories, and warehouses that lined the Brooklyn waterfront. They crossed the Brooklyn Bridge by the thousands, settling along the docks near the Navy Yard and Red Hook, where the rent was the lowest and the work was the dirtiest. But the most notorious neighbourhood they took over was a tough little district known officially as Vinegar Hill, named after a famous 1798 Irish uprising against the British, but locals soon renamed it to something that fit the mood better. It was known as Irish Town, and while it may have offered some relief from Manhattan's overcrowding, Irish Town wasn't much of an upgrade from the 5 Points. It was a maze of crooked alleyways and murky streets, lined with wooden gangways and collapsing brick tenements that let in neither light nor air. Families crammed 10 to a room, and infants were dying so frequently that no one bothered to keep count. Life in Irish Town was not so much an escape from hardship as it was a cruel continuation of it, repackaged in American brick and urban decay. These were the famine Irish, fresh off the boats, straight from the ports of Cork, Dublin and Belfast. Their accents were heavy and unwelcome. They brought their religion with them, Catholicism, which only made life harder. In a deeply Protestant America, Catholicism was seen not just as foreign, but as threatening. It was called superstitious, unclean, and disloyal. Irish Catholics were accused of worshipping idols and serving a foreign pope. It didn't matter that large parts of Brooklyn were Catholic, the Irish still weren't welcome. They faced signs in shops and saloon windows that said, "No blacks, no Irish, no dogs." Few employers were willing to hire them, and their vacancy ads read, "No Irish need apply." Schools punished their children for using Irish words or speaking with an accent. Irish Protestants sometimes fared slightly better, but even they were often treated as second-rate citizens. For Irish Catholics, it was open warfare. They had been sold a dream that America was a land of opportunity, a place to escape poverty and British cruelty. But in many ways, America was even worse than what they had left behind. Irish Town became the 5 Points of Brooklyn, a district so dominated by Irish immigrants that outsiders called it lawless. It was a place of both refuge and exile, where newcomers clung to their own because no one else would have them. The isolation bred resentment, and out of that came something darker. Gangs weren't formed out of ambition, they were born from necessity. And one of those gang members born out of necessity was Dinny Meehan. Meehan was born in 1889 at his family's home at 187 Adams Street, deep in Irishtown. And from the very beginning, life hit him hard. His mother died when he was only 6 years of age, and his father swiftly abandoned the family. He was left to fend for himself and roam the streets, trying to survive. By the age of 10, he'd already served time at the Elmira Reformatory and the notorious Blackwell's Island Workhouse, which was a brutal institution and one that was only reserved for the city's most violent and hardened men. But he walked out of each stint more confident than before. He regularly boasted that he would never see the inside of a state reformatory, and he was right. By the time of his release, Dinny Meehan was one of the best thieves in New York. He was a natural. He led the Red Onion Gang out of Warren Street, a crew of Irish toughs who controlled the lion's share of North Brooklyn. The name Red Onion came from their signature stick-up method. They specialised in robbing small shopkeepers, usually by pretending to be customers. They'd walk into a grocery or pushcart stand and ask for red onions. Then, while the grocer turned his back to grab the produce, they'd pull a revolver and then rob the register and vanish into the streets. He had no patience for cowards and no fear of consequence. By 1913, at the age of 24, he had killed at least 7 men, 4 of whom were his own allies, previous members of the Red Onion Gang, who had either challenged his authority or failed to keep the crew in line. Fighting and murder amongst themselves was common in the heavy drinking, tight-knit Irish crews of North Brooklyn, and Meehan, a man who regularly sank a bottle of whiskey before 9 a.m, had no issue eliminating threats from within. He was feared, respected, and absolutely ruthless. Under his leadership, the Red Onion Gang became more than just a crew of stick-up kids. They were a serious operation, holding court over the piers, warehouses, and street corners of a city that was still reeling from war, poverty, and immigration. Meehan wasn't just trying to survive by this point, he was ready to dominate. If Dinny Meehan was the most feared man in Irishtown, then Wild Bill Lovett was the second. Born in Lixnaw, a small village in the north of County Kerry, Ireland, on July the 15th, 1893, Lovett came from a respectable Catholic family. Like so many Irish families of that era, the Lovetts emigrated to America in search of a better life and settled in at 155 Prospect Avenue in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn. Unlike Meehan, Lovett had the structure of a religious household behind him. His father worked as a dockside watchman and he was a devout Catholic who hoped that his son would one day join the Franciscans. For a while, it seemed possible. Bill was well-spoken, well-read, and he finished school, which was rare for boys in his neighbourhood, but the streets, well, they had other plans for Bill Lovett. By the time he turned 20, Wild Bill Lovett's name carried weight across North Brooklyn. He'd already been arrested 15 times and had spent 6 months in Raymond Street Jail, his most serious charge coming after he threatened to stab a police officer with a bail hook, something he kept on his person constantly next to his pistol. Wild Bill didn't look like a gangster, he looked clean-cut, well-dressed, and almost approachable. But that was the trick. He couldn't fight much with his fists, but he was always armed. He had a reputation for violence, especially when drunk, and enjoyed gunfights. The wilder, the better. And that's how he earned the nickname Wild Bill. Just like the old Wild West gunslinger Wild Bill Hickok. Lovett liked his shootouts loud and public. Around this time, Lovett crossed paths with another rising Irish gangster, Richard Joseph Lonergan, better known as Peg Leg. Born on January the 16th, 1900, at 113 Johnson Street in Irishtown, Lonergan came from a family deeply embedded in New York's underworld. His father, John Lonergan, was an Irish-born bare-knuckle boxer, and his uncle was James Yakey Yake Brady, leader of the Yakey Yakes, a fearsome Manhattan street gang known for their battles against Monk Eastman and the Five Pointers. His father and his mother, Mary Lonergan, had both been part of the Yakey Yakes and were both suspected in shootings and several murders of rival gang members. Crime wasn't just in Peg Leg's blood, it was the family business. He was one of 15 children, most of whom were involved in the family's main hustle, which was a bicycle hire shop at 259 Bridge Street. But the Lonergans being the Lonergans, well, these were not ordinary rentals. The bikes were stolen in Manhattan and ferried across the Brooklyn Bridge by the Lonergans to be repainted, rebranded, and hired out to the unsuspecting customers. On one of these bike stealing excursions, young Richard was hit by a cable car, resulting in the amputation of his right leg above the knee. He was fitted with a wooden prosthetic, and from that moment on, he was known by the name that would make him infamous, Peg Leg Lonergan. By the time that Peg Leg was 11, he had already been arrested 18 times, and 3 of those were for carrying a gun. And he'd killed at least 3 rival Irish kids by the time he was 13. Though he operated his own crew, Peg Leg soon came under the wing of Wild Bill Lovett, and together they ran extortion rackets on wagon drivers and stevedores, especially targeting the foreign labourers who worked the docks. They also shut down Italian-ran craps games and dice operations, robbing them at gunpoint. His sister, Anna Lonergan, was no less notorious. Known as the Queen of the Irish waterfront, she enforced her family's dominance with a mix of intimidation and violence, though rarely needed to lift a finger, as the Lonergan name alone carried weight. All 3 men, Dinny Meehan, Wild Bill Lovett, and Peg Leg Lonergan, coexisted in North Brooklyn during the early 1910s, each controlling slices of dockside territory in a volatile alliance. Their primary income came from the Brooklyn waterfront, which, at that time, was nothing short of a gold mine. They held sway over key areas like Red Hook, the Erie Basin, and Irishtown. Cargo ships arrived constantly, unloading everything from tobacco to textiles, coffee to coal. The docks were the lifeblood of New York commerce. Control them, and you controlled a major artery of the American economy. Through labour intimidation, extortion of dock workers, and hijacking of cargo, they made themselves indispensable or dangerous to every operator on the waterfront. But in 1913, a new threat began to take shape. A rising 20-year-old Sicilian named Frankie Yale, who would soon become the most feared Italian gangster in Brooklyn. Yale headed a crew that, like many Italian criminal outfits at the time, became associated with what the press and public called the Black Hand. Not a formal gang, but a label used for loosely connected extortion rings made up of Italian immigrants who often preyed on their own communities through threats, violence, and intimidation. Italian businesses would regularly receive letters with a Black Hand imprint on it, telling them to pay the Black Hand a weekly tribute or their business would burn down. Alongside Yale were men like the vicious Willie Two Knife Altieri and a young, untested Al Capone. Together, they began inching toward the Brooklyn docks, drawn by the wealth and control that the Irish held there. The Italians were different. They didn't drink on the job. They were cold, organised, and very disciplined. And they didn't just want in, they wanted to take over. The sharp-minded Dinny Meehan understood one thing clearly. Divided, the Irish didn't stand a chance against the growing strength of the Black Hand, but united, they might just hold the line. So, in response, he brought together his own crew with those of Wild Bill and Peg Leg Lonergan, and together they formed what became known as the White Hand Gang, a name deliberately chosen to stand in opposition to the Black Hand. But this went deeper than just gang rivalries. Across Brooklyn, Irish and Italian communities resented one another bitterly, locked in a daily struggle for jobs, housing, and neighbourhood turf. So, when Meehan's White Hand Gang drew its line in the sand, it wasn't just about power, it was about pride, legacy, and race. It was a bold and public promise. The Brooklyn waterfront would remain Irish, no matter the cost. In the short term, Meehan's strategy worked. The Italians were kept off the North Brooklyn piers, and the White Hand Gang tightened its grip on the waterfront. Central to their success was the infiltration of the International Longshoremen's Association, also known as the ILA, and it was the union that controlled who got hired on the docks. By bribing union officials and intimidating the rest, the White Handers ensured that only their loyal men received work, while rivals were shut out or extorted. Control of the ILA wasn't just about jobs, it was about controlling the flow of commerce. Every crate, every barrel, every load that passed through the Brooklyn waterfront, well, it meant profit. By manipulating hiring halls and labour actions, Meehan's crew could extract kickbacks, skim off shipments, run protection rackets, and maintain surveillance over every inch of dockside activity. Infiltrating the ILA gave them more than power, it gave them permanence, and for a time, it worked. Still, the White Hand Gang wasn't satisfied with simply holding what they had. They wanted more, and specifically, they wanted the Brooklyn Navy Yard. But that presented a problem. The Navy Yard was federal property under the jurisdiction of the United States government, not just the NYPD. Security was tighter and access was stricter. Gangs couldn't control it the way they did the civilian piers along the East River. Despite this, there were vulnerabilities. There were labour unions that could be bullied, dock bosses and captains who could be bought, and standing in their way was one man, Christy Maroney. Maroney was a quiet, discreet and effective dock boss who had carved out a profitable foothold along the eastern edge of the yard, and he refused to join the White Hand Gang. But refusing Dinny Meehan usually only ended one way. On the morning of March the 13th, 1913, at 5 a.m, Wild Bill and a White Hand Gang enforcer called Cute Connolly, called so because he was anything but, walked into Jacob's saloon at the corner of Sands and Adams Streets and shot Christy Maroney dead. It was a cold-blooded, calculated assassination because Meehan wanted the Navy Yard, and after that morning, he had it. From that moment on, the docks in North Brooklyn were run with an iron fist. Meehan installed himself as the dock boss of the entire waterfront, and every terminal, Pier 1, Pier 2, all the way up, as well as being extorted, now also had to pay a weekly tribute to the White Handers. Their headquarters was a building at 25 Bridge Street known as the Dock Workers Club. Every Monday morning, factory owners, warehouse managers, and stevedore bosses from the ILA were required to report there with their weekly tribute. Every labourer working the docks had to report to Dinny Meehan personally under the Brooklyn Bridge every morning. The White Handers used these numbers to calculate the weekly tribute owed from the bosses. The Dock Workers Club was perfectly positioned, equidistant between the Navy Yard and Pier 1, right in the heart of their kingdom. Truck drivers coming into the freight yards also fell under White Hand control. If they refused to use White Hand muscle to load their freight and had maybe brought their own labour from New York City, they were beaten senseless. It didn't take long before everyone fell in line. There was no oversight, no law, only silence, as Willie Sutton, one of America's most notorious bank robbers and an Irish Town native, put it years later. There was a code of silence in Irish Town that was observed more faithfully than Omerta was in the Mafia. No one ever talked in Irish Town. They never gave information to the police, and they kept disputes among themselves. That silence wasn't just cultural, it was enforced. The White Hand Gang didn't just control the streets, they controlled the whole system around them. This was Brooklyn, not Manhattan, and that mattered. In Brooklyn, the police were easier to buy, and the law bent more easily to the will of those with money and muscle. By the late 1910s, the White Hand Gang had most of North Brooklyn's police department on their payroll, and they ruled their turf with an iron fist. But that grip began to slip in 1917, when the gang's most dangerous enforcer, Wild Bill Lovett, was conscripted into the US Army to fight in the trenches of World War I. Peg Leg Lonergan avoided the draft thanks to his missing leg, and Dinny Meehan, it turned out, had contracted chlamydia, which disqualified him from service. The irony was brutal. The one man they couldn't afford to lose was the one man that Uncle Sam came for. Wild Bill had always carried himself with a kind of reckless ambition. He was assigned to Company C, 13th Machine Gun Battalion of the 77th Infantry Division. And when he was shipped off to France, he didn't angle for a desk job or a safe posting behind the lines. He picked what the army called the Suicide Squad, a frontline machine gun company. He wanted action, and he got it. Lovett's most heroic act came during the brutal Meuse-Argonne offensive, one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Lovett was presented with the Distinguished Service Cross after he rescued two comrades during a night attack in the Argonne forest. Under a barrage of German gunfire, Bill crawled through no man's land to drag both men back to safety. It was an act of extraordinary courage that earned him his medal. When Wild Bill came home, it was with shrapnel in his hip, a lung full of mustard gas, and that Distinguished Service Cross pinned to his chest. He didn't care much for the honour, but he made sure that everyone in Red Hook and Irish Town knew about it. The medal gave him a reputation. The limp from the shrapnel and the wheeze in his lungs only added to his mystique. He was a war hero now, but more than that, he was a war-hardened killer. He returned to Brooklyn like a general returning to his troops, ready to reclaim what was his. But what he found was a gang in turmoil. Whilst he'd been fighting the Kaiser, the heavy-drinking, increasingly paranoid Dinny Meehan had been cleaning house. 10 men, at least, had been murdered on Denny's orders during the last 4 years. Many of them had been close to Lovett, friends, lieutenants, men like Mickey Gilligan and John Malone, both of whom no photos have survived of, and both of whom had helped Lovett rise to second in command of the White Handers before the war, and they were now both dead. Denny's drinking had become even worse. All three of them were crippling alcoholics, but as Dinny drank, he got more and more paranoid, suspicious of anyone who might challenge his control. The way he saw it with Wild Bill at war, any loyalty to Bill was a threat to him, and he feared that some of Lovett's lieutenants would try to knock him off. Peg Leg Lonergan had said nothing. He bit his tongue and kept his head down, waiting for Wild Bill's return. Denny welcomed him back with a grin and open arms. but his fate had already been sealed. Wild Bill smiled back, but in his mind, the wheels were already turning. Meehan had made too many enemies, killed too many allies, and now the one man who might stop him, the man with war in his blood, was back on the streets of the Brooklyn docks. But before Wild Bill could think about taking over, he had a more immediate problem to deal with, and that was the Black Hand. Less is known about the Black Hand Gang because they were more secretive than their outspoken Irish rivals, but beneath their silence, their story, well, it almost mirrors the Irish one as they too were forged in hardship. Italy's late 19th century emigrants came to America in desperation. They weren't fleeing a singular famine like the Irish, but rather something slower and more grinding. They were fleeing relentless poverty, natural disasters, and decades of political neglect. Following the unification of Italy in 1871, the country's southern provinces, places like Calabria, Campania, and Sicily, were trapped in economic ruin. Generations of foreign rule, brutal taxation, and fragmented farmland left most southern Italians with little hope of survival, let alone prosperity. Farming families faced impossible odds, too many mouths to feed, not enough land to till. Parents buried children lost to hunger and disease. Entire villages lived under the thumb of corrupt landlords or local strongmen, with the government in the north offering no protection and no future. Over just a few decades, disaster compounded disaster, malaria outbreaks, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 1906, and the catastrophic Messina earthquake in 1908. Similarly to the Irish, leaving wasn't a choice, it was survival, and for many, they set their sights on a new life in America. By this time, steamship travel across the Atlantic had become more affordable, and letters and stories from earlier migrants painted the United States as a land of opportunity. Labour recruiters and returning emigrants spread word that, in America, even unskilled labourers could earn far higher wages than in Italy. For many impoverished Italians, the chance to go abroad temporarily, earn cash, and return home with savings was a new hope. More than 4 million Italians arrived in the United States between 1880 and 1914, and the vast majority of them were from poorer southern regions. Many of these migrants were young men who left their wives, children, or parents behind, planning to work for a few years in America and send money back home. They were often called birds of passage, planning to stay for a short time before returning back to Italy. The greatest concentration of Italians settled in Manhattan, especially downtown areas like Mulberry Street, forming the iconic Little Italy enclaves. These immigrants tended to cluster tightly by hometown and region in a phenomenon known as campanilismo, which meant loyalty to one's local community. Entire villages from Italy would reassemble on the same city block or tenement building in New York. Neighbours from Calabria or Sicily often stuck together, preserving their dialects, customs, patron saints' feast days, and close-knit social networks, just as in the old country. By 1920, New York City alone was home to over 800,000 Italian Americans, making them the second largest ethnic group in the city after Jews. The sheer size of these communities provided comfort and cultural continuity, but it also meant that poverty and struggle became highly concentrated in certain neighbourhoods. Faced with relentless poverty and few legal opportunities, some Italian immigrants turned to crime. For a few of these, it wasn't just a matter of desperation, it was a way to seize control of a world that had given them nothing. And one of those men was Frankie Yale. Born Francesco Ioele in Longabucco, Italy on January the 22nd, 1893, Yale came to America with his family in 1900. They settled in Brooklyn, and by his teenage years, Yale had already made his name in street brawls and petty thefts. Mentored by Johnny Torrio and initiated into the 5 Point Gang, the same gang that Peg Leg Lonergan's mum and dad were battling, Yale Americanized his surname and adopted a new philosophy: crime as an enterprise. After Torrio left for Chicago in 1909, Yale began building his own empire in Brooklyn. He first targeted the ice trade. At this time, before refrigerators were common, ice was essential to daily life in New York. Households needed it to preserve food. Butcher shops, fishmongers and restaurants depended on it to stay in business. And Yale saw an opportunity in this everyday necessity, and similarly to how the Irish had controlled the freight and cargo rackets, Yale established control over key ice delivery routes in South Brooklyn, using a combination of bribery, intimidation, and raw muscle. Ice delivery drivers who worked without his blessing soon found their carts overturned, their horses beaten, or their clients threatened. Those who played by his rules paid him a cut of their earnings in exchange for protection. But in truth, it was extortion. But to the public, Yale presented himself as a legitimate businessman. He dressed well, ran a funeral parlour at 6604 14th Avenue in Bensonhurst as a front for his operations, sold cigars with his own face on the packet, and made a show of giving back to the Italian community, regularly hosting block parties, paying for funerals, and even giving turkeys to the poor at Thanksgiving. Behind the charm, though, was a cold and ruthless operator. He used the profits from the ice racket to finance more rackets like gambling dens, brothels, and loan sharking rings. And every business he touched, he ran with the same strict logic. Loyalty was rewarded, disobedience was punished, and territory was never shared. Bit by bit, Yale carved out a criminal infrastructure in Brooklyn that was organised, profitable, and quietly expanding beneath the surface of the city. Yale's outfit welcomed Italians of all regional backgrounds, Calabrians, Neapolitans, even Abruzzese, as long as they were loyal, effective, and shared his vision for power. And one man who ticked all those boxes was his most feared enforcer, Two Knife Altieri, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Neapolitan with an icy temperament and a taste for violence. Altieri earned his nickname for always carrying, and often using, two knives strapped to his waist. Altieri preferred close-up kills, strangulations, stabbings, or gunshots to the head. Victims were often buried in the woods of New Jersey, but virtually nothing is known about his early background or his birth. But he was a man who stood at 5'7", weighed 170 pounds, and despite his tough reputation, his hands were described in police reports as soft, remarkably similar to a woman's, and Altieri was often seen using his knives to clean his nails and exfoliate his palms, and he had such a strong attachment to them, he would sleep with his knives strapped to his person. Also under Yale's wing was a young thug named Alphonse Capone. Born in Brooklyn in 1899 to Italian immigrants from Angri, near Naples, Capone spent the first 14 years of his life at 95 Navy Street in downtown Brooklyn, right next to the Navy Yard in White Hand territory, and naturally, he grew up with a hatred for the Irish, one which was reciprocated by Peg Leg Lonergan in particular, who absolutely despised Italians. When he was 14, the Capone family moved to 38 Garfield Place in Park Slope, which was now Black Hand territory. The move to Garfield Place was a step up for Capone. it was a slightly more stable, working-class neighbourhood compared to the tougher, more chaotic Docks area. He bounced between street gangs in his youth, the Junior 40 Thieves, the Brooklyn Rippers, before landing in the 5 Points gang where he met Johnny Torrio. But it was with Yale that Capone got his first real start. Capone worked the door at Yale's Harvard Inn Saloon on Coney Island and quickly proved himself reliable, volatile, and ambitious. He learned the business, the brutality, and the politics of the underworld from Yale. And once his apprenticeship was served, Yale's men, including Capone and Altieri, set their sights on carving out their own piece of the waterfront empire that the Irish had built. And with that, the Battle of Brooklyn Docks was about to commence. By 1918, tensions on the Brooklyn waterfront had reached boiling point. Frankie Yale and his crew began pushing aggressively onto dock territory that had long been held by the Irish. Yale was sending men to extort Italian labourers on the docks or pressure Irish stevedores at the most southern piers of 8 and 9. The White Hand Gang, hardened by years of control and accustomed to ruling the piers with impunity, had no intention of conceding ground without a fight, and as a result, what followed was a brutal and chaotic turf war. It started with a message. On February the 24th, 1918, an Italian enforcer named John Somo, of whom no photos have survived, was sent to the docks by Yale to extort protection money from Irish stevedores, a bold move deep into White Hand territory. But Somo never made it back. He was found bleeding out on the curb outside 50 President Street, just south of Pier 9, shot down by Wild Bill Lovett himself. Rushed to the hospital, Somo refused to speak, allegedly telling police to go fuck themselves before dying from his wounds. When officers scoured the neighbourhood for witnesses, the response was as expected: silence. No one had seen or heard a thing. As winter gave way to the spring, the bloodshed escalated. On May the 8th, Two-Knife Altieri, a man with a reputation for vicious precision with his trusty knives, ambushed and butchered Cinders Connolly, one of Dinny Meehan's closest lieutenants, in a dark alley off Poplar Street. Cinders Connolly was gutted so savagely that even the most hardened ambulance drivers on the scene turned away in horror. His intestines quite literally spilled onto the pavement, which left a message to the Irish written in blood. But just 1 week later, on May the 15th, Altieri struck again, disemboweling another white-hander named John Maroney, of whom no photographs have survived of, in similar fashion. By now, the public was rattled. These weren't ordinary gangland killings, they felt ritualistic, surgical, and rumours quickly spread that a serial killer, not a gangster, was prowling the streets of North Brooklyn, and the press and the public quickly convinced themselves that a ripper, similar to Jack the Ripper in London, was roaming Brooklyn, and panic was spreading like wildfire. By July 1918, the White Hand Gang had lost 2 high-ranking men to Altieri's blades, and their appetite for revenge was overwhelming. Peg Leg Lonergan and Wild Bill Lovett received a tip that every Tuesday, Two-Knife got a haircut and a shave at a small barbershop on Ocean Avenue in Sheepshead Bay, far from Irish-controlled turf. Armed and grim-faced, they made the long drive out of their territory and walked into the barbershop. Without a word, they raised their pistols and executed the man in the chair with 2 bullets to the skull, but they had killed the wrong man. The victim wasn't Altieri, but Tommaso Gibaldi, a 44-year-old Sicilian labourer with no known ties to organised crime. Gibaldi left behind a wife and 4 children, including his eldest son, a 16-year-old aspiring boxer named Vincenzo Gibaldi. The boy would never forget the day his father was murdered by Irish gangsters. Years later, he would reinvent himself in Chicago as Machine Gun Jack McGurn, Al Capone's right-hand man, a fearsome enforcer in the Chicago outfit, and one of the brains behind the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre, and one of the most well-known hitmen of the Prohibition era. Just months later, Capone himself was about to earn the nickname that would follow him around for the rest of his life: Scarface. On December the 8th, 1918, a 10-minute drive from the scene of Tommaso Gibaldi's murder, Frankie Yale's Harvard Inn in Coney Island was buzzing with weekend revelers. Among the crowd was a New York hood named Frank Galluccio, who was aligned with Joe the Boss Mazzaria, the main man in New York, and Galluccio arrived with his sister, Lena. At around 9 p.m, Al Capone was working his usual role as a bartender-bouncer hybrid at the club. As Galluccio's party settled in, Capone started staring at Lena, smiling, leering, and making her visibly uncomfortable. Embarrassed, she whispered to her brother and asked him to intervene. Galluccio approached Capone and politely told him to knock it off. Capone brushed it off, leaned closer to Lena, and said, "Honey, you've got a nice ass, and I mean that as a compliment, believe me." Well, that was it. Galluccio snapped. He ordered Capone to apologise and warning him not to disrespect his sister. Capone smirked, held out his hands, and said, "Come on, buddy, I'm only joking." "This is no fucking joke," Galluccio replied. When Capone lunged at him, Galluccio reached for a steak knife on the table and slashed him across the face 3 times. He'd been aiming for Capone's throat, but Galluccio had been drinking, and instead, he left a brutal gash from Capone's ear to his jawline. Capone was rushed to Coney Island Hospital and required nearly 30 stitches. In the aftermath, the underworld called a sit-down. Lucky Luciano, a heavyweight New York gangster, was sent by Joe the Boss Mazzaria and warned Capone to let it go, and Yale agreed. Galluccio had acted in defense of his sister's honor, and any retaliation from Capone would not be tolerated. Capone grudgingly agreed and offered a formal apology. By 1919, the violence hadn't let up, not for Capone or his newly acquired scars. That year alone, an estimated 15 men died on each side of the escalating war between the Irish and the Italians. Capone, Two Knife Altieri and Frankie Yale kept pushing forward, trying their hardest to carve out a share of the Brooklyn waterfront. Wild Bill Lovett and Peg Leg Lonergan responded with equal brutality. Bodies turned up all over the docks whenever they caught wind of an Italian enforcer. Al Capone was quickly earning a reputation as a ruthless up-and-comer, willing to kill, maim or torture any Irishman who stood in his way. He would often go mick hunting with Two Knife Altieri and other Black Hand members, storming into Irish saloons in Red Hook and Irishtown just to beat down white-handers for sport. In July of 1919, Capone crossed paths with a tough Irishman named Artie Finnegan in a Brooklyn saloon. That night, Capone wasn't on one of his mick hunting rampages. He was collecting protection money for Yale, but Finnegan, like most white-handers, couldn't hide his hatred for Italians. He taunted Capone, mocking Irish girls who married into Italian families. This was personal, as Capone had just married an Irish girl, May Coughlin, the previous December. Artie knew exactly what he was doing. Capone, unarmed and furious, lunged. He beat Finnegan so savagely that he thought he had killed him. Finnegan survived, but barely. He spent over a month in the hospital, his face so mangled that he was almost unrecognisable. Yet again, no one in the saloon claimed to have seen a thing, and the code of silence saved Capone once more. But the message travelled fast. When Wild Bill Lovett heard what Capone had done to Finnegan, he was livid. He made it clear he would hunt Capone down and kill him. The problem for Capone was visibility. His now iconic scars made him easy to recognise, and the Irish had eyes everywhere in Brooklyn. His days were numbered if he stayed. And Frankie Yale knew it. The Irish were brutal, and it was only a matter of time before Wild Bill got close enough to take the shot. So, in late 1919, Yale quietly sent Capone west to Chicago, where he would work under Johnny Torrio's expanding empire. Capone left Brooklyn under the alias of Al Brown, hoping to avoid detection by any white-handers. Once he arrived in Chicago, that might come looking for him. It's been reported that Capone left Brooklyn for the untold riches that lay in Chicago, but in truth, Capone didn't leave Brooklyn for opportunity. He left because he had no choice. Not only was Wild Bill hunting his blood, but of the 15 white-handed deaths in 1919, Capone had carried out 3 or maybe 4 of them, and one in particular, the shooting of a white-hand enforcer at a saloon in Sheepshead. The police were pressing on witnesses, and they had a lead. The NYPD now hunted him, as well as the White Hand Gang also putting a target on his back. And around the same time that Capone left for Chicago, the Irish spilled blood in his place. On October the 31st, 1919, an Italian gangster named Samuel D'Angelo was gunned down at the docks. Wild Bill and Cute Connolly were seen fleeing the scene and briefly caught after a short chase, spending Halloween night in Poplar Street Jail. But, as always, the right bribes ensured that they walked free. The murder of Samuel D'Angelo marked the final bloodshed between the Irish and the Italians for a while. With prohibition on the horizon, the Italians turned their eyes towards liquor and the fortune it promised. But while the Italians got rich off outlawed liquor, the Irish got drunk off it, and in typical white hand fashion, they began killing each other. 1920 marked a seismic shift in the criminal underworld of New York. That January, prohibition became the law of the land. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act had outlawed the manufacture, sale and transport of alcohol across the United States. For law-abiding citizens, it was the dawn of temperance. But for gangsters, bootleggers and anyone willing to break the law, it was the beginning of a gold rush unlike anything the American underworld had ever seen. Overnight, the price of liquor skyrocketed. A bottle of cheap whiskey that once sold for $1 could now command 10 times as much. Banning alcohol didn't reduce demand, it actually made it stronger. Speakeasies cropped up across the city in their thousands. Nightclubs, soda shops, restaurants, they all became fronts for illegal booze. The cops couldn't stop it, and in many cases, they were in on it. And as the profit margins ballooned, so did the stakes. For the Italians, this was an opportunity to build empires. Organised crime as we know it now didn't exist before Prohibition, at least not in any structured form. But the profits from bootlegging gave rise to something new, the Mafia as a transnational business enterprise. Men like Frankie Yale, Johnny Torrio, and the up-and-coming Al Capone suddenly found themselves at the helm of highly organised, multi-million-dollar operations. Yale's operation, once a local extortion outfit, now had drivers, distributors, brewers, distillers, hitmen, and political contacts. Prohibition didn't just make the Italians rich, it gave them structure, hierarchy, and power. Meanwhile, the Irish street gangs that had dominated the pre-prohibition era began to flounder. The White Hand Gang was powerful, yes, but it was a relic of a different time. Dinny Meehan was reluctant to adapt. He liked the old way. They didn't drive fast cars or buy downtown real estate. They stayed in the same dingy neighbourhoods that they were born in. They drank in the same bars. They slept in the same rooms. Prohibition didn't modernise them. It exposed their limits, and the Italians knew it. And now they wanted to get serious about controlling the docks. The Italians thought that the main threat to their planned docks takeover was Vanny Higgins, the so-called last Irish boss of Brooklyn. Based in Bay Ridge, he ran his own successful bootlegging operation and had his own logistics empire on Long Island. He was Irish, but at a sit-down, Yale learned he was not an ally of the White Handers and he wasn't interested in the docks. That left the waterfront ripe for the taking, and with prohibition, it was even more coveted by Yale and his crew. The docks were no longer just a source of cargo to hijack or workers to extort, but they now viewed it as a logistics hub for their booze. They knew that the docks now, more than ever, were an absolute goldmine. Inside the White Hand Gang, Dinny Meehan's stubbornness was causing problems. Wild Bill wanted to modernise, to take the docks and use them to move liquor, as the Italians intended, and utilise it properly. Not just steal a few boxes of cigars a day, or extort a few dollars from a truck driver, and Peg Leg Lonergan backed the idea. They saw already, just months into prohibition, how much cash the Italians were making. But Dinny wasn't convinced. He didn't want to change. He liked the gang the way it was, tight, fearsome and loyal. And more importantly, Dinny was a born thief and he liked stealing and the thrill that it gave him. He told Wild Bill and Peg Leg to be content with the money that they were making, as they weren't short of $1 or $2 either. And he was right, they were not short of cash. Because around this time, in February 1920, the White Hand Gang pulled off one of their biggest heists yet, stealing $10,000 worth of shoes from the Hannon & Sons warehouse at 54 Bridge Street, which equated to over $190,000 in today's money. Hannon & Sons was one of the largest shoemakers in the city, and its wealthy owner, John Hannon, publicly vowed to bring the culprits to justice. He hired Manhattan detectives, as everyone in Brooklyn knew the local police were on the gang's payroll. But after an intimidating visit from Cute Connolly and Peg Leg, Hannon quickly dropped the investigation. Despite the lucrative score, Dinny Meehan's refusal to change and his growing paranoia started to upset the apple cart. It's no exaggeration to say that the Irish were constantly piss drunk. They met at the Dock Workers Club before 8 AM most days, after counting the labour they had out that day to charge the pier bosses. Then they'd spend the morning planning robberies, keeping an eye out for Italian enforcers, or seeing what their men had skimmed from the ships that day. But by 9 AM, Dinny Meehan was known to have sunk a bottle of whiskey already to himself, so God knows how much he drank for the rest of the day. His second in command, Wild Bill, well, he was a known alcoholic. Truth be told, he was a crippling alcoholic. He was known to drink around 3 quarts of whiskey a day, which is about 6 pints or 4 litres. Now, I usually keep neutral when doing these documentaries, but 6 pints of whiskey a day is absolutely ridiculous. Then there was Peg Leg Lonergan. So he was obviously the youngest of the trio, but he was the hardest drinking out of all of them. He drank beer, he didn't drink whiskey, but he drank it all day, every day, and apparently could drink up to 25 pints of ale in a day. He was arrested over 16 times for fighting or offering out police officers on street corners, usually outside saloons. Now, Peg Leg was completely insane, but even he could see how much it was costing them to feed their habits, with booze now increasing tenfold in price, not to mention the rest of the 100-ish members of the White Hand Gang, and they all couldn't understand why Dinny Meehan didn't want to run his own booze, save a fortune, and adapt to the times. Dinny Meehan sensed a revolt brewing. His paranoia deepened just as it had during the war years when Wild Bill was in France, and Denny had taken the opportunity to wipe out nearly 10 loyalists to Wild Bill, something that Bill hadn't forgot, and now he wanted the throne. And on March the 31st, he took it. Dinny Meehan was sleeping off a night, or probably a morning, on the booze, in his bedroom at 432 Warren Street, a modest flat above a neighbourhood delicatessen. It was around 3 PM when two men arrived, Wild Bill and Peg Leg. Meehan's young son stood by the door and told them, "Don't go in there, my mama and papa are asleep." Wild Bill gently patted the boy on the head and said that they were just going to peek inside. The child tried to block them, but was pushed aside. Suddenly, 5 shots rang out. One bullet struck Denny in the head, killing him instantly, aged 31. Another struck his wife Sadie in the shoulder, and luckily she survived. Sadie Meehan would tell police that the man who killed her husband was none other than his second in command, Wild Bill Lovett. The next morning, word had already spread, and the stevedores and White Hand men who had gathered at the headquarters at 25 Bridge Street were deep in speculation, most of it accurate, about who had pulled the trigger. Many were still loyal to Denny and viewed Bill with suspicion. To them, he was the soldier who'd vanished to fight in Europe while they held the line on the docks. Then the door opened and in walked Wild Bill, with Peg Leg Lonergan at his side. His face was pale, his eyes cold and blazing, and weighing barely 110 pounds. Wild Bill entered the back office. The brutes of men, in comparison to Bill, instinctively parted to let him through. Without hesitation, Wild Bill walked to Meehan's old chair and sat down. "From now on, I'm the boss in here," he told them. "I'll be detained up at the police station for a day or two, but when I come back, I'm going to be boss." Before police arrived, he had already assigned jobs and promoted lieutenants to keep the operation running in his absence. And, all too typically, there was no evidence tying Wild Bill to the murder. The assassin had stood on a chair outside Meehan's bedroom, slipped a pistol through the transom above the door, and opened fire. It was a calculated and clinical execution. The only witness was Denny's young son, who claimed to recognise the two men responsible, but the police dismissed the child's testimony as unreliable. Still, in the streets and on the docks, nobody doubted who was behind it. Everybody knew that Wild Bill had taken out his boss, and now his authority was absolute. He didn't lead gently either. He ruled through fear, and his claim to power was sealed in blood. He doubled his tax. When wages were $6 a day, he took $2. When they dropped to $4, he took $1. If a factory owner or a stevedore boss was late with his tribute to the gang whilst Denny was in charge, he got a beating. If they were late with their tribute under Bill's reign, it was a hospital visit. If there was ever a second time, it was a bullet in the head. No rule book was needed for the new regime. Wild Bill's rules were firmly understood. With Dinny Meehan gone, for many of the White Hand Gang, they'd lost more than just a leader. They'd lost the real sense of unity. Many of them didn't like Wild Bill, and what followed wasn't just a shift in power, but a slow and public unravelling. Bootlegging was making the Italians rich, and with their money came structure, ambition and strategy. The Irish, meanwhile, had nothing to unify them but grudges, old loyalties and whiskey. And so as the Italians tightened their grip on Brooklyn's future, the Irish unravelled. Old grudges flared into feuds, whiskey flowed heavier than ever, and pistols were within arm's reach. Although Denny's death had sent shockwaves across the docks, the real bloodbath was only just beginning. 6 months after Denny's death, on September the 21st, 1920, while sitting in the front room of the Rupert Saloon at the corner of J and Front Streets, 28-year-old Dan Gillen, an enforcer of the White Handers, was shot and killed. The murder went unsolved, but years later, the Queen of the Irish waterfront, Anna Lonergan, explained that Wild Bill was in the bar and that he knew Gillen's loyalty laid with Meehan, not him. He wanted an excuse to kill him, so when he saw Gillen pick up a cat by its tail and swing it, Wild Bill, who had a soft spot for animals, shot him twice in the head. Gillen was dead, and this was really the first sign that the gang was starting to spiral out of control. As was Wild Bill's wish, the White Handers were running rock gut booze through the docks, but they couldn't organise it like the Italians did. They drank most of what they were moving, and they were getting sloppier with so much more alcohol readily available to them. At this point, Frankie Yale focused on bootlegging because the White Hand gang was taking care of itself. He knew the drunken, violent, feuding Irish gang was getting weaker, and it was just a matter of time. For the rest of 1920, the press estimated that there were over 20 killings of White Hand gang members, and they were nearly all a result of Dinny Meehan's loyalists and men who didn't like Wild Bill being picked off. This infighting climaxed with the attempted murder of Wild Bill himself, one of those aforementioned Meehan loyalists, Tim Montague, a husky, two-fisted Irishman who had the balls to speak his mind openly about Denny's death. At first he got away with it, and then others began to talk, emboldened by his example. But Wild Bill, being Wild Bill, was not going to let them get away with it. In December, Bill spoke sharply to Montague and he got a hot reply as Montague left the Dock Workers Club. That night, in a speakeasy on Front Street beneath the bridge, Montague boasted of his defiance. He wasn't scared of any Lovett that ever lived, and with the fog of whiskey on him, he wasn't afraid to meet Wild Bill right then. As Montague left the speakeasy, unsteady on his feet, an automatic machine gun blazed 3 times and Montague slumped to the floor with 3 bullets in his back. No one saw the killer emerge from the shadows. No one heard anything to indicate his identity. But by morning, Wild Bill was locked in that familiar police cell on Raymond Street. With no evidence or witnesses willing to speak, Wild Bill was released. As he left the police station that winter afternoon, Wild Bill declined Peg Leg Lonergan's offer of a ride. Whether it was pride, paranoia, or sheer defiance, he chose to walk alone. But as he turned a corner, a dark automobile pulled in behind him, slowed to a crawl, and rolled up beside him. Without a word, a pistol appeared through the open window and 2 shots rang out. 1 bullet struck Wild Bill in the leg, sending him crumpling to the ground. He immediately underwent surgery to remove the slug and survived the hit, but when the police came calling with questions, he gave them nothing. Still, he knew exactly who had pulled the trigger: Gary Barry, Dinny Meehan's former right-hand man. Barry had always seen himself as the rightful heir to the White Hand throne, believing that the wiry, erratic Wild Bill wasn't fit to lead, and they both held the same ranking under Denny's rule. He had gathered a loyal few, including the vengeful Tim Montague, who had already paid the price for turning against Wild Bill. Sensing an opportunity in Bill's weakened physical state, Gary Barry struck again. On the night of January the 21st, barely 4 weeks after the first ambush, a patrolman found the door to a shanty at 289 Front Street swinging open. Inside, buried amongst crates of homebrewed beer, lay Wild Bill Lovett, motionless, bleeding, and shot 3 times in the chest. But death, once again, passed him by. Miraculously, none of the bullets had pierced his heart. He was unconscious, but alive. When the police came to question him, Lovett gave them nothing. "It's give and take in this game," he muttered. "When I get it, I take it and say nothing." But somehow, he rose. He recovered to have the most murderous year of his life, and he was finally ready to wipe out the last of Dinny Meehan's boys. The doctors who treated Wild Bill swore that it wasn't luck or medicine that kept him alive. It was pure stubbornness. He barely spoke during his recovery, keeping to himself, brooding in silence, quietly piecing together a plan for revenge. When the detectives came again asking questions, he gave them nothing. He admitted he'd been shot near the corner of Front and Gold Streets, just a short walk from where they'd found him, but beyond that, no names and no hints. The man who had pulled the trigger was James Martin, a former white-hander who defected to Gary Barry's crew. There are no surviving photos of Martin, but he spotted Wild Bill drunk in a speakeasy and saw his chance. He followed him, waited for the right moment, and then fired 3 shots into his chest before dragging his body into that nearby shanty and leaving him for dead, and Martin nearly succeeded. But once Wild Bill was back on his feet, he wasted no time. In May, James Martin dropped dead. 2 bullets straight through the head. No one saw the shooter, but no one needed to see the shooter. Martin had been one of the men involved in the ambush back in January, and everyone in the White Hand Gang knew it. There were no headlines, no statements, and no arrests. Then came Tim Quilty, another one of Barry's loyalists and another of whom no photos have survived. One day, Wild Bill asked a group of stevedores, "Where the hell is Tim Quilty? Haven't seen him around." One of them answered that he's at the speakeasy at Jay and York, and that was all Bill needed. Quilty was inside with a dozen other men, drinking and laughing, just like any other day. Then a single shot rang out. When detectives questioned the room, every man claimed he hadn't seen a thing, hadn't seen a soul, but there was Tim Quilty, face down on the floor, dead. No one talked to the police, no one cared. Everyone knew who pulled the trigger and no one was prepared to be the next one on the other end of it. Wild Bill was picking off Barry's gang, one defector at a time, but Gary Barry himself had gone underground. He vanished into New York City, hiding in safe houses, avoiding Wild Bill's hunt. No one could find him, so Wild Bill turned his attention to those who had stood beside Barry during the ambush, and next was Eddie Hughes. Eddie had a reputation as a dependable triggerman, and detectives believed he was one of the gunmen involved when Wild Bill was nearly killed outside the police station that winter. Wild Bill never said his name because he didn't need to. When the time came, Eddie Hughes paid the price. On July the 17th, Hughes was found dead, another victim of a bullet that no one saw, fired by a shooter that no one could name. The press this time erupted. With only a few headlines that summer, editors demanded action from the NYPD. They counted the bodies piling up around Wild Bill and demanded justice, but no one could prove a thing. As the story usually goes, there was no evidence linking Wild Bill to the shooting. The police said that they had no doubt. They told press outside the Raymond Street jail that, of course Bill did it, and why wouldn't he? But when it came to pressing charges, there was nothing. Just another dead man and another score settled by Bill. After a year of relentless bloodshed, Wild Bill finally got what he'd been working toward: revenge. One by one, he had picked off every major Meehan loyalist who had dared stand against him, leaving only one man left to settle the score. The one who had given the order to pull the trigger that nearly ended his life. And on December the 13th, 1921, that score was settled. Gary Barry, the last serious challenger to Wild Bill's rule, was found face down on Dean Street, shot once in the back and twice more in the head, just for good measure. The message couldn't have been clearer. Wild Bill was arrested later that evening, but he came prepared. He claimed he spent the entire night at a saloon in Red Hook, and no fewer than 20 dock workers, drinkers and barflies swore they'd seen him in there the whole time. Whether any of them were telling the truth didn't matter, because the alibi stuck. As he left the station house, he was mocked by reporters who pressed him for a comment. Bill just smirked and said, "You guys are all off. I didn't kill Gary. I'd have liked to have. He was the guy who shot me when I left the station after the Montague shooting." With Barry dead and at least 5 other defectors already buried, the last remnants of Meehan's old crew were gone. There were no more rival factions, no more whispered challenges to Bill's authority. He had eliminated them all, efficiently, brutally, and publicly. In the aftermath, Wild Bill ruled what was left of the White Hand Gang with total control. For more than a year after Barry's death, he held the Brooklyn docks with an iron grip, or, as the men on the piers liked to say, with a rod that blazed. But just because Wild Bill was firmly cemented as the boss, it didn't mean that the violence stopped. In 1922, a young Italian man named Umberto Anastasia landed a job as a longshoreman on the Brooklyn docks. He didn't speak a word of English, but that hardly mattered to the White Hand Gang. They saw him as just another body that they could exploit, assigning him to a stevedore and skimming $2 off his $6 weekly wage. His poor English only made it easier. They figured they might even bleed him for more. 3 months into the job, Umberto began helping himself to whatever cargo he could quietly pocket. The odd packet of cigars here, a lump of coal there, maybe even a bottle of whiskey. He would sell the stolen goods in the Italian speakeasies down the block. It was petty theft, but it added up. Eventually, his boss, another Italian named George Torino, caught him in the act. Torino tore into him, warning him that if the Irish found out, they'd kill them both. But Umberto, fearing that George might turn him into the White Handers to save his own skin, took matters into his own hands. The very next day, he pulled a knife and killed Torino. Umberto was arrested almost immediately. When questioned, he gave the police a different name, Albert Anastasia, and was charged with murder. With the White Hand Gang breathing down the court's neck, as it was in their interest to get an Italian killer off the streets, and the docks simmering with tension, Anastasia's fate looked sealed. He faced the electric chair at Sing Sing, but inside the prison walls, fate intervened. At Sing Sing, Anastasia came under the wing of an older inmate, a man named Sammy the Shiv Di Stefano. He was a close associate of Lucky Luciano, and Di Stefano had deep ties to the rising Italian underworld. Though no photographs of the Shiv survived, his influence was real, and he saw potential in the young killer. Cold-blooded, fearless and unrepentant, Anastasia was exactly the kind of man that Luciano's growing empire needed. Di Stefano reached out to Luciano, vouching for Anastasia as a valuable recruit. Luciano agreed, and over the next year, the 4 longshoremen who had witnessed Anastasia kill George Torino began turning up dead one by one. Eventually, all 4 were eliminated, silenced before they could ever testify. By the summer of 1923, with no witnesses left alive, the case against Albert Anastasia collapsed. The murder charges were dropped, and a future mafia executioner had been born. That same summer, another explosive event shook the Irish side of the docks. In April 1923, Anna Lonergan, the Queen of the Irish waterfront, was at the centre of a family tragedy. During a heated argument in the family's bicycle shop, Anna's father, John Lonergan, struck her mother, Mary. In response, Anna pulled a gun and shot him dead. When police arrived, they initially arrested Mary, assuming that she had pulled the trigger, but the White Hand Gang quickly moved in to protect their own. With their influence and payroll stretching into the legal system, Mary was quietly released. Anna never faced charges, and the matter, as far as the law was concerned, was closed. During the murder trial, Wild Bill Lovett found something that no one expected: love. At the celebration following Anna Lonergan's mother's release, Lovett turned to Anna and confessed his love for her. He told her, "I'm washed up on the whole business now. I'm done with it. Let's get married." Anna, who had quietly adored Wild Bill since his return from the war, squealed with delight and agreed without hesitation. Within 10 minutes, the whole group, more than a dozen strong, piled into taxicabs and sped to the Marriage License Bureau. Though it had just closed for the day, the clerk was convinced, without threats, to open up one last time. Lovett and Anna were married on the spot, and when reporters approached, Lovett grinned and said, "If there are any more murders in the next 2 weeks, they ain't mine. I'm honeymooning in Long Beach." And for a time, he meant it. Anna persuaded Bill that the gang life was now finished, that a cottage in New Jersey and a steady job were worth more than all the bullets and the blood, and he agreed. So she took his money and found a quiet little house near Little Ferry in New Jersey, complete with green shutters and a porch. She filled it with furniture, and for a moment, the most dangerous man in Brooklyn was off the streets. Peg Leg Lonergan took over as temporary boss, believing that Bill might one day return. And he was right, because in the 3 months that Wild Bill was away, everything began to fall apart. The Italians muscled their way into Pier 6 through Pier 9, gradually seizing control of nearly half of the Brooklyn waterfront. They didn't just use muscle, they used money. Bribes flowed steadily to the officials in the International Longshoremen's Association, allowing them to gain influence where the Irish had once held sway. The Italians also treated union leaders with far more respect and far less violence than the hard-drinking, often brutal Irish ever had, and that shift is what mattered. The ILA began to welcome their presence, opening the doors that the Irish had once kicked down. Meehan's loyalists were dead, the crew was decimated. Peg Leg Lonergan was drinking more than ever and slipping into volatility, and the White Hand Gang itself was losing its grip. Sobered by his time away and frustrated by what he was hearing, Wild Bill finally cracked. In late October, he told Anna that he had business in New York. She made him promise not to go back to Brooklyn, and he swore that he wouldn't, that he'd only go to Manhattan and come straight back, and she never saw him alive again. 2 days later, on November the 1st, 1923, police kicked in the door of the Dock Workers Club at 25 Bridge Street and found the broken body of 29-year-old Wild Bill Lovett. The back of his head had been caved in with a heavy iron object, and the fractured bone had been driven deep into his brain. Death would have been instant, but whoever had done it wanted to be sure. They'd shot him 3 times in the head after he was already dead. Peg Leg Lonergan and Cute Connolly, his most trusted lieutenants, told detectives that the 3 of them had been drunk for 2 days. They claimed Bill passed out and they brought him to 25 Bridge Street to sleep it off. After finishing a bottle of whiskey, they left him there. The police believed them. Their bond was well known and the pair of them were visibly devastated. But there were no witnesses, no clues. Whoever killed Bill had moved quickly and silently. Wild Bill was probably killed by 2 knife Altieri. Word had gotten to the Italians that Lovett was back in town, and since they had muscled their way in, they had eyes everywhere. Wild Bill, likely spotted drunk in a saloon, had been an easy target, and the Italians wanted to get rid of him in case he tried to take the docks back from them. He was buried in Cypress Hills National Cemetery with full military honours. A battalion of his comrades from the 13th Machine Gunners, Company C, fired a salute and played taps at his funeral. The soldier and gangster who had dodged bullets in France and Brooklyn was finally at rest, and the Italians were licking their lips. Peg Leg Lonergan, his brother-in-law, assumed permanent leadership of the White Hand Gang, but it was already too late. The Italians controlled half the docks, the Irish were leaderless and fractured, and no one, not even Peg Leg, could hold back the tide. Peg Leg Lonergan's 2-year leadership of the White Hand Gang was defined by violence, desperation, and the slow erosion of Irish power on the Brooklyn waterfront. From the moment he took the reins after Wild Bill Lovett's bloody demise, Peg Leg faced relentless pressure from the Italians. Now having joined the Frankie Yale mob were ruthless young enforcers like Vince Mangano, Joey Adonis, and the aforementioned Albert Anastasia. All three were determined to wrestle control of the docks from the fading Irish stronghold. In March 1924, the Italians launched their first decisive strike. Peg Leg Lonergan was playing the piano inside the Home Brew Club on Gold Street when Two Knife Altieri and Joe Adonis leapt from a taxi and stormed inside. 2 quick shots to the stomach dropped Peg Leg, but he survived. 3 months later, in June, he retaliated with fury. Accompanied by his loyal enforcer Q Connolly, Peg Leg burst into an Italian speakeasy on Coney Island, guns drawn and blazing. Their target, Two Knife Altieri. Altieri narrowly escaped with his life. He leapt from a 2nd-story window and broke his ankle in the process. And the next 18 months of the war brought a steady stream of blood. Irish and Italian bodies piled up as the two factions fought for supremacy. The Italians, wealthier and more organised thanks to the profits of prohibition, continued to slowly take control of more piers, and the control of the docks overall began to shift. But Peg Leg's reign was not just battered from the outside. The very shape of his gang was changing. Where Lovett had ruled with fury, Peg Leg lacked the ruthless fire needed to keep such a loose group of drunkards in line. He had neither the ambition nor the discipline, and the gang began to fragment. He was content to drink, gamble, womanize, and issue the occasional order, while rival outfits eyed his territory with hungry precision. As 1925 came to a close, the Italians struck again. His right-hand man, John Healy, was killed by Italians on the docks shortly before Christmas, and more bad news was in store for Peg Leg as an old foe had returned to town. In December of 1925, Al Capone returned to Brooklyn. His young son, Sonny, was suffering from a serious mastoid infection, and the best specialists for the necessary operation were in the city of his father's birth. The surgery was successful, though Sonny would be left partially deaf for the rest of his life, but at least it was no longer in danger. May Capone stayed at her mother's house to look after their recovering boy, whilst Al took the opportunity to see some old friends. He wandered back into his old haunts and familiar shadows, eventually making his way to an Italian-run speakeasy called the Adonis Social Club, located at 152 20th Street in Brooklyn. It was a 2-story building with a basement. The bottom floor was painted black and the top a faded yellow, and above it lived a family of 6. On Christmas Day, 1925, Peg Leg decided to celebrate with 2 trusted men, his closest friend Aaron Harms and the notorious Needles Ferry, called so because he was a drug addict. They went out on the town. Eventually, they ended up at the Adonis Social Club, well out of their territory, but nevertheless, the mood was festive, the drinks were flowing, and the music of a piano echoed through the smoky air. 2 Italian girls from the neighbourhood were there, and they drank and danced with the men who ran what little the Irish kept onto on the docks. And they weren't discreet. Peg Leg was in high spirits and unbelievably loud about it. He bought drinks for the room, played the piano with a bottle of whiskey resting at his feet, and shouted Christmas toasts whilst insulting a table of 4 Italians who they didn't know were associated with the Black Hand. Peg Leg wouldn't have cared anyway, even if he did know. He was an Irish patriot through and through and absolutely despised Italians. As the night wore on, the group of Italians sat quietly in the adjoining room, waiting for an opportunity. When 3 Irish girls entered the club on the arms of their Italian dates, who were friends of the other Italians sat at the table, Peg Leg chased them out, shouting after them, "Come back with white men, for Christ's sake." It was at that moment that, without warning, the lights went out, the club turned black, until it was lit again, but this time it was lit with pistol fire. In the confusion, there were no words exchanged, only the metallic clatter of chairs scraping, glasses shattering, and the first thunderclap of gunfire. The 4 Italian men who sat down were silhouetted only by the brief flashes from their automatics. From the front door, the 3 men who had been chased out with their Irish dates, one of them being Al Capone, opened fire from the doorway into the club. The first bullet struck Needles Ferry as he stumbled towards the exit. He cried out once, collapsed at the base of the stairs, and then bled out on the icy curb outside. Inside, Peg Leg and Aaron Harms stood their ground, back to back, revolvers drawn. They fired wildly into the darkness, returning shot for shot. Harms caught one in the throat. Peg Leg kept firing, even as he was hit again and again. By the time the shooting stopped, both men lay dead against the wall, next to the piano, slumped together and still clutching empty pistols. The room was silent as the Italians made a quick exit. Police arrived 15 minutes later after a beat cop noticed Ferry's body sprawled across the curb. Upstairs, they found chaos frozen in time. Tables overturned, blood pooled in the corners, shell casings littering the floor. The bartender had fled, the beer was still cold, and on the bar, a rag remained exactly where it had been dropped mid-wipe, as if even the furniture hadn't had time to react. Needles Ferry, Aaron Harms, and Peg Leg Lonergan were all dead. All were 25 years of age. Needles and Peg Leg were both hit 6 times, and both men had at least 1 bullet ripped through their whiskey-soaked brains. And the next morning, the pictures of the Adonis Club massacre hit the front pages. Just hours after the newspapers hit the streets, 9 men were arrested, including Al Capone. According to police, Capone had orchestrated the massacre the moment he'd heard that Peg Leg Lonergan was inside the Adonis Club. There was no telephone on the premises, so it's believed that one of the Italians slipped out briefly to make a call. Knowing that Capone was at the Columbia Hall, located at 725 Union Street in Park Slope, his usual haunt whenever he returned to Brooklyn. In all honesty, it's unlikely that Capone had come with murder in mind. If a hit had been planned from the start, then surely he would have brought a Chicago typewriter, or a Tommy gun as it's more commonly known. More likely he just intended to rough them up. But when Peg Leg humiliated him, throwing Capone, his friends and his girls out of the club, something in Capone snapped. It was personal, because he'd never forgotten the humiliation of being driven out of Brooklyn by the Irish. And that night, he saw a chance to settle that old score. He quietly alerted the other Frankie Yale men stationed at the back of the club, and the bartender was also a Yale underling, and he killed the lights. And well, as they say, the rest is history. The Adonis Club massacre became the first, but not the last, massacre that Capone would mastermind. It was also a glimpse into what Al Capone had learned during his rapid rise in Chicago. how violence could be used not just to settle scores, but to reshape the underworld itself. He had brought Chicago's new philosophy back to the streets of his hometown, swift, surgical, and final. And in doing so, he delivered a brutal Christmas gift to his former mentor, Frankie Yale, the complete removal of the last true leader of the White Hand Gang. Within weeks, the case against the men collapsed, thanks to the combined efforts of Yale, Vincent Mangano, Joe Adonis and Albert Anastasia. Witnesses from that night stopped talking, statements were retracted, and evidence simply vanished. No charges stuck, no one was convicted, and no one sought justice. Peg Leg Lonergan was given a full gangster's funeral. Thousands lined the streets outside his home at 738 Myrtle Avenue, paying their respects as his casket passed. He was buried at Cavalry Cemetery in Queens. At the burial, Anna Lonergan, Peg Leg's sister and the widow of Wild Bill Lovett, stood quietly in mourning. When a reporter asked what she thought, she muttered coldly, "It wasn't one of ours. You can bet no Irishman would kill like that on Christmas Day." She was half right. The Adonis Club massacre marked the end of an era. It was practically the last flicker of Irish dominance on the Brooklyn waterfront that was extinguished by a flurry of gunfire on a bitter Christmas morning. Peg Leg Lonergan joined the long and growing list of Irishmen who had died trying to keep the Brooklyn waterfront in Irish hands. And there was still a few more yet to fall. By this time, Anna Lonergan had moved on from the death of Wild Bill. She had remarried a white-hander named Matty Martin, one of her late husband's underlings, who now assumed leadership of what remained of the gang. But not everyone agreed with the succession. Cute Connolly believed that the title should have gone to him, and many others quietly supported that claim. As we get towards the end of the war, I think what happened next may be the best story to sum up the White Hand Gang. In a bid to avoid further bloodshed, the remaining gang members agreed to settle the matter with a card draw at the Dock Workers Club. Whoever pulled the highest card would become boss. A man named Red Egan, of whom no photographs have survived of, drew the Ace of Hearts. But before anyone could celebrate, Cute Donnelly accused him of cheating, claiming that he pulled the card from his sleeve and shot him dead. Red Egan's reign had lasted less than 30 seconds. Eventually, Cute Donnelly pulled the winning card and took over the leadership, but for the next 2 years, the White-Handers barely made a sound. Their presence on the docks had evaporated. They had been completely outmuscled from the Brooklyn waterfront by the Italians, and they were now reduced to small-time bootleggers operating far from the piers that they once controlled. Then, in January 1928, Cute Donnelly was found dead in a checkers cabin on the Columbia Line at Pier 3. He'd been shot 3 times in the head. Detectives believed he'd been drunk, trying to muscle his way back onto the waterfront, perhaps deluded enough to think that he still had the ghosts of his old leaders standing behind him. He was wrong. They were dead. His body was dumped into the East River by Frankie Yale's crew and recovered a few hours later. By 1928, Frankie Yale had achieved what every gangster in Brooklyn dreamed of. He had complete control of the borough and its docks, was a millionaire many times over, and had become one of the most powerful organised crime figures in America. But no one stays on top forever. In the spring of 1927, cracks began to form in his long-standing friendship with Al Capone. Yale was one of the biggest importers of Canadian whiskey in the country and had been a trusted supplier to Capone. He oversaw the shipments from the moment they hit the docks in Brooklyn to the moment that they were loaded into trucks bound for Chicago. But then those trucks started getting hijacked again and again before they ever left New York. Capone suspected a double cross, and so he dispatched an old friend, a man named James D'Amato, of typically whom no photos have survived of, to keep an eye on things in Brooklyn. And it didn't take long. D'Amato reported back that Yale himself was behind the hijackings, but once D'Amato's presence became known, the game changed. On June the 25th, 1927, he narrowly survived a failed assassination attempt after Yale apparently discovered his true identity. A year to the day after the attempted hit on D'Amato, on Sunday afternoon, July the 1st, 1928, Yale was relaxing at his Sunrise Club, located at 14th Avenue and 65th Street, when he received a strange phone call. The caller told him that something was wrong with his new wife, Lucy, who was home watching their 1-year-old daughter. He jumped into his brand new coffee-coloured Lincoln Coupe and tore off up New Utrecht Avenue. He didn't know that he was being followed. Trailing him was a Buick sedan carrying 4 armed men. Yale's Lincoln had been modified with armour plating, but the dealer had forgotten to bulletproof the windows. A shotgun blast hit him on the left side of the head, and a burst from a Tommy gun tore through his brain. Either wound would have been fatal. The Lincoln swerved off the road, hopped the curb, and slammed into the stoop of a brownstone at 923 44th Street. It was the first time that a submachine gun had ever been used in a New York gangland killing, and Capone had brought Chicago's bloody new philosophy to the streets of his hometown once again. After Yale's death, his most feared enforcer, the mysterious two-knife Altieri, vanished off the face of the earth. Some say he believed Capone would come for him next, and so he disappeared out west. But literally nothing more is known about his later life or his death, which, as you can tell, annoys me. As for Capone himself, he went on to dominate Chicago like no gangster before him, wielding power that extended from City Hall to the streets with near absolute control. After Yale's murder, the future of Brooklyn's waterfront passed into the hands of Albert Anastasia, a man who would dominate the docks like no one before him. By the late 1920s, Anastasia had risen to a leadership role in the International Longshoremen's Association, controlling 6 powerful union chapters across Brooklyn. He aligned himself with Joe the Boss Mazzaria and transformed the docks into a profit machine with military precision. Today, the Brooklyn waterfront bears little resemblance to the battleground that it once was. The piers that were once soaked in blood are now home to cafes, artisan bakeries, and yoga studios. Apartment buildings and tech startups now line the streets, where men like Wild Bill Lovett, Peg Leg Lonergan, and Frankie Yale fought for control. A place once ruled by bootleggers and racketeers now attracts tourists, creatives, and entrepreneurs. And yet, the ghosts of that old world are still here, buried beneath cobblestone alleys and faded signage, beneath the pavement of Red Hook and the shadows of Vinegar Hill, remembering what this place once was. The front line in a brutal war between the Irish White Hand Gang and the Italian Black Hand, fought not just with fists and bullets, but with pride, fear, loyalty, and blood. Because once upon a time, these docks weren't just a place of work, they were a battlefield. Thanks so much for watching. It truly is a fascinating tale, and one that I just can't believe no one's made into a TV show or a movie. I really think it's got legs. Well, maybe after watching this they will. Please like the video and subscribe if you enjoyed, and if you want to join in the discussion, you can in my Discord server, which is now free for everyone. It's an app where we discuss these characters and stories I cover in more detail, and to be honest, we talk about everything else. I'll leave the invite link in a pinned comment thing on this video if you do wish to join. If not, absolutely fine. and I shall see you in the next one.